you're a fairly well-established composer, and you've been doing this for a while. You're a founder and artistic director of Camerata Nova. I'm sad to say I didn't know your music until a few years ago, and I think your music is only recently really coming this far west to Vancouver.
It's funny because my mom was originally, well, my adopted mom, but she's my mom. She was originally from Courtenay, BC. So we used to go to the West. I think of myself as honorary West Coast. But my music kind of went east for a long, it's continued to go east. So I've been lucky enough to get great commissions at the Toronto Symphony and the Mendelssohn Choir. But it's been slow to get out to the West Coast, which is fine. I mean, it just, you can't control these things.
Yeah.
But I remember when you contacted me, I was like to my partner, musica intima, musica intima. I was really excited. It's like a kid at Christmas.
Good. Oh, I'm so glad. Well, we're very excited too. So for those of our audience who are going to see you as a pretty new face, what's your story? How did you get to music? How did you get to composition?
Well, I started singing as a choir boy in a men and boys choir in Winnipeg. So that's actually where my interest, well, not only choral music, but interest into early music came about, because I come from an early music background. I used to sing countertenor, and Camerata Nova in Winnipeg was founded on that love of early music. Okay. So we went to England every couple of years in the men and boys choir. So singing Byrd and Gibbons and Tallis in those cathedrals was quite special, even as a young child. I remember, that's some of my musical highlights. And I got an instrumental scholarship from that church to study trumpet. So I went really heavy into the brass world for a long time. I actually went to the University of Manitoba majoring in trumpet, but halfway through I kind of I reignited my love for choral music, so I switched to conducting. So I was lucky to have an amazing choral prof, Ken Randbrecht, who is a kind of the godfather of choral music here in Manitoba. And that's where things shifted in terms of the choral world. But it wasn't until I started Camerata Nova in 1997 that I actually started writing or doing composition. And even then, it was only just I was writing for one of the members who was getting married, so I wrote her a little anthem called "God Be My Head," and it pretty much started there. I mean, I didn't study composition. I didn't think of myself as a composer back then. I really wanted to conduct, but slowly, because I also have free blood in me. I'm a 60 scooper, meaning I was taken away from my blood in 1967, the year of my birth, at 6 months old, and then switched luckily to a family that was very, very musical, very supportive, very loving. I grew up with CBC radio on all the time, so that that's my love of classical and choral music came on towards me. But unlike so many of my blood brothers and sisters and other Indigenous people that went from foster home to foster home, I was very, very lucky. Very lucky that I didn't go down that road. So I'm very fortunate. Yeah. But in terms of in the last 15 years, I guess things have really taken off as a composer. I do write sacred texts such as Rosa Mystica, but I do a lot of Indigenous based pieces, either in Cree or Ojibwe or Inuktitut. And I really, it's part of exploring who I am, or trying to explore my culture and some of the stories, whether they're tragic or joyful. It's just a way of exploring, I guess, my blood memory. So it's been a long journey, and it's still a journey that I'm actively taking part in, but it's great.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting looking at your list of works. It is maybe surprising, I don't know, but there's a lot of sacred music in a very that early music style. It's new music, but with that early music roots, and then there's a lot of music on Indigenous themes. I was going to ask if there's something you prefer, but it sounds like it's just those are two parts of you that you like to bring out.
Definitely, and I have been getting a lot of commissions in the last little while for Indigenous pieces, but I mean the early music is really the core of sort of what I love. I love either whether it's the Monteverdi Vespers, the Pretorius Christus Mass, or just a motet by Byrd or Victoria or Palestrina. It's sort of in fact, when the early in the first wave of the lockdown and pandemic here in Toronto, I was going back to a lot of sort of YouTube of beautiful, sometimes just that wash of a motet a cappella polyphony coming over me was therapeutic.
Yeah.
And especially when we realized that, we couldn't sing. I really, I think everybody's going through this. The things that we took for granted, we're starting to really appreciate now, particularly in choral singing, which we can't do together anymore. But it still doesn't replace going to a live recording or singing, live concert or singing together. But it certainly has helped me through this time. But I'm very, very influenced by early music, and I think you could probably tell in some of my choral music.
I wonder how, you said you're doing a lot of commissions right now. How do you approach writing Indigenous music for a settler choir? Like, is that
is a very that's actually a constant conversation that's happening, I think, particularly now, because people have a lot more time to reflect. In fact, early next year, I'm doing a panel with the Vancouver Bach Choir about decolonizing music, and this is a conversation that's been going on a lot, and it's still. I feel that Camerata Nova is definitely not Indigenous. It's considered to be a settler choir.
Right.
I'm Indigenous, but I'm the only one in the organization that can identify that way. But I think it's the spirit that we approach things. It's protocols, it's respect, but it's still a huge battle because, the choirs that you and I are familiar with is very Eurocentric. Depending, whatever we're singing, it's very Eurocentric. I think that in terms of, we have a wonderful conductor in Winnipeg that does my stuff. His name is Mel Braun. He's a vocal professor at the University of Manitoba. He is what I would call an ally. One, he wants to make sure the language is right, and the choristers know it, and the context. Right. Because, as choirs, we sing in all types of languages. So, but suddenly there's this huge barrier when it's like, oh, it's in Cree or Ojibwe, and many choral directors don't want to touch that because they feel that they're unprepared or unwilling to tackle just a language like that. I know in BC, there's probably the most forward-thinking in terms of operas or choral. Victoria Symphony is doing amazing stuff in the past several years. Like the choirs out there, the institutions. I think there's a healthier approach to Indigenous collaborations. Of course, you have the great Marion Newman that's from out the West Coast, and she's probably one of, I hate to put labels like an Indigenous soprano or stuff like that, but she's certainly a leader in terms of collaborating and pushing projects that are Indigenous based. I think about in terms of colonial choral music, or is sort of like we need Indigenous people's voices in these projects. For the past, back when I first started choral music, there were almost no Indigenous composers in the classical vein or choral vein. Maybe Barbara Kroll, who is still a leader in our communities. But apart from that, I felt alone in Winnipeg, really isolated. Luckily, I had Camerata Nova, and maybe that isolation helped me develop. But I can honestly say right now, there's a whole new generation of young Indigenous artists and composers that are coming through, get classically trained. And I think it's a very exciting time. A lot of that has to do with the landscape and the truth and reconciliation calls to action. But we still have a long way to go. And I'm thinking what the world has seen in this past 8 months is that there's a lot of turmoil, and it's a lot of culture versus culture. Luckily in Canada, it doesn't seem to be as bad in other places, but we still have a huge issues here in Canada. And Indigenous artists are writing about things like clean water, murdered and missing women, suicides. These are very harsh topics and subjects for the rest of Canada to hear, but we still need to bring that in front. And if a choir that's not Indigenous is willing to go that step, I think that's the spirit of truth and reconciliation, which I say is never, truth and reconciliation is not a destination, it's an ongoing journey.
Well, and you've been a leader in the field, right? I have a book here, I'm sure you know the Dylan Robinson book.
Yes.
And so he goes through sort of a survey of concerts and events that have taken place sort of tackling different issues, and he draws attention to one in 2010, a concert entitled Medieval Inuit is presented by Camerata Nova, a choral ensemble specializing in the performance of Renaissance music. At this concert, throat singers present songs passed down from elders. And the concert brings Nordic folk songs and art music together with Inuit throat singing and drum songs to stage an imagined historical encounter between the Vikings and the Dorset peoples. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that project.
Well, that was one of my first major collaborations. And actually, that project, I got a grant to go up to Iqaluit, which is the first time, and the only time actually I've been up to the far north. And I worked with my dear friend, Madeline Alakarialak, who is part of that project. She took me to the land, which I think was really important. I mean, it wasn't the land that I was addressing. That's more East Coast, but you know, Baffin Island is still an incredible landscape to be on the land and to meet the people. It was a huge collaboration, but I think in terms of, and it did sort of show me into the power of collaborating. And I don't speak Inuktitut, but it's a very, very rhythmic and musical language. It's so rooted in the people on the land. And I felt that project was, you know, a kind of a gateway for me to get into more of that. We're going to be doing that again this year in Camerata Nova, but we're going to do it virtually, of course, because we were planning to do it for the new opening of the Inuit Gallery for the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which is, you know, the largest collection of Inuit art in the world. We're going to do that online now, unfortunately, but it's interesting because I haven't looked at the score for years, but when I looked at it, you know, months ago, I still have part of me in part of that project. We've done other things now. We do have a Truth and Reconciliation series where we invite other Indigenous artists or composers to take part in the collaboration. Or, you know, like we did a concert called Fallen, and we had 3 different Indigenous artists write a piece based on that word fallen or taken, or captive is this year too. So I'm writing a piece about Poundmaker, the peacemaker chief from the Cree peacemaker chief that took part, that was jailed for not taking part in, he was tried for treason, but he did not take part in the Red River Rebellion. So it's a tragic story, but we have, you know, it's kind of a way to sort of like, I guess, address these harsh issues, but also have other voices besides myself. And I learned from too. In that Dylan Robinson book, Dylan's, you know, just an amazing academic person. He is very prolific. In fact, we had just got that book a couple of days ago. My partner is writing a huge report about Indigenous theater and the arts and consulting. And so I haven't actually delved into that book yet, but I'm looking forward to getting into it.
It's fantastic, and it's totally reshaped for me the way I even approach the idea of collaboration. I mean, he talks a lot about truth and reconciliation and how maybe actually the goal is not this idea of reconciliation, but the goal is decolonization, right? And it's just, there's a lot, I think, of settler choirs like ours that need to actually read this and stop just thinking about a report we read with calls to action 5 years ago, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because that book is so articulate and Dylan is very articulate, and there are so many different perspectives that are important for all of us to hear. But I also feel that it's getting better in some ways because, you know, for instance, in, you know, what was it, 2017, when the 150th anniversary of the colony of Canada, and so many arts organizations were approaching Indigenous artists to, you know, but they were just checking off the box for grants. Suddenly you had all these artists, Indigenous artists, that were being asked to do collaborations, and, you know, but a lot of arts organizations had their own ideas of what they wanted that Indigenous artist to write about. So I'm very lucky. I haven't had too many experiences like that. I've had a few where the artistic directors have their own idea of what, you know, what they want, what the subject's going to be, what the topic's going to be, the style, the medium. And that was problematic. You know, that's actually where I went to Ottawa for Canada Scene in late June of 2017. And the first week was called First Scene. And that was a celebration of Indigenous arts. And Camerata Nova went and did a major work there called Taken. But we all talked about this idea. It's like, man, all these organizations are just checking off the box. You know, they weren't really culturally or protocol backed, you know, approaching these projects. Many of these people are well intentioned. They weren't evil or bad or what have you. They were just, they had their own ideas. Like, you know, like can we have more eagle cries, or can we have a, Navajo flute here, or,
Right.
things, like I had a friend, one of my dear friends in Winnipeg, he always said, you have to look beyond the beads and feathers, like that sort of, and that's sort of exactly in a nutshell what we, many Indigenous artists have faced. Now I'm, in some ways, I'd never identified in my early life as Indigenous. I guess a part of it was shame. I don't know the language that well. So, and also I grew up, in a men and boys choir. My father was an Anglican priest, and I went to university, and I was studying Mahler and,
Right.
Gabriele and all these things. So I guess I thought I was the furthest thing away from so-called Indigenous, but I guess this last 20 years have been sort of a reawakening of my blood memories, which took a long time. I'm 53. So,
Yeah.
For half of my life, I kind of ignored my blood, I guess. So I'm rediscovering it through music.
Well, one of the projects or interests I heard you talk about when you did an interview with Kathleen Allen earlier in the pandemic, you were talking about translating bird motets and
Yes.
translating psalms into Cree and stuff like that. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what drew you to that.
Well, definitely my love of bird and Elizabethan repertoire. And it's funny, I grew up, I guess, as I mentioned, in this ivory tower of choral music, because I used to think that modern music back when I was young was Howells or, like Vaughan Williams. I didn't know anything about Parrott or Penderecki until I got to university. So, and we only sang 1 or 2 motets a year by bird, and it was always Ave Verum Corpus, maybe, like in another one, but I didn't realize that Bird wrote hundreds of motets and masterpieces, almost like chamber music for voices. I had no idea. So when I started to really get the scope of the, the Gradualia books and Tallis's influence and all the incredible stuff that Tallis and Bird had written, I came to this idea of, like, I actually did a motet, and it changes of course it changes the texture when you translate it to Cree or Ojibwe. It is a bit problematic for some Indigenous people because there is different sort of perspectives of church and sacred music and what have you. I'm not a churchgoer. I'm not a Christian really per se, but I'm attracted to the spiritualness of choral music and sacred music.
Let's talk a bit about Rosa Mystica. So it looks from the score that there have been a couple geneses of the piece.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the, because I've written so many choral pieces, but that one actually sticks in my mind because I wrote that in 2003 in Banff, and I was taking part in the chorus of John Astachio's Philomena, and it was the first and only time I've actually taken part in a professional opera production. And it was a great experience, in terms of, we had a lot of downtime, so I decided to write for a dear friend of mine, Carolyn Boyes. I've always been attracted to that text. There's something I find very magical about that text. Of course, most of us have done the medieval arrangements of the 3-part arrangements, and then I think there's been several 20th century arrangements of that text. But I was always, I'm drawn very closely to drones, whether it's a crystal bowl or Tibetan bowls or overtones. We use a lot of that in my music in Camerata. And so it did have, a couple of different arrangements, or, it was a little bit of a process. I was still early in my writing career. But I always encourage choral directors to experiment with, in terms, it doesn't have to be a crystal bowl. It doesn't, it can be whatever it intuitively fits within the group. But it still has its homage, so to speak, to that medieval feel, and the rhythmic lines and things like that. We recorded it years ago, in I think our second album, when people were still making CDs. But we were basically, that was an early sort of, it's changed since we've done it in the past too. You know what happens, sometimes you just have a different perspective. Yeah. I'm very happy with that piece, but it's, 2003 seems a long time away, but it's still, that style is very close to my heart.
If there's one thing you would want our audience to know or to listen for, what would that be?
Good question. I think that there's something again about the text that really, really captivates me. Like, let's face it, because I just realized this maybe a week and a half ago, right? Right after, I was in back when stores were open, or, even going to a grocery store. It's this onslaught of horrible, horrible music, Christmas music. And it's just it's a global phenomenon. Like, that it becomes like, I can't believe that cheesy country arrangements of We Three Kings, or, and it sticks, it's an earworm. So I'm walking out of the grocery store humming that horrible arrangement. And I still feel as when I hear good choral music, whether it's the Nine Lesson and Carol service from King's College, Cambridge, or when I hear a really nice arrangement on CBC or the radio or what have you, it's still a magical experience to hear that. And I think we can battle against that horrible onslaught of sound pollution with something, like beautiful arrangements, whether it's a Wilcox or a Ledger or what have you. I still feel that, again, Rosa Mystica is an homage to that. Like, it's just feel that it's beautiful text. I'm happy with the music, the way the music fits in, but it's also that, that medieval, idea. I'm just actually reading the third book from Hilary Mantle's Wolf Hall series about Thomas Cromwell. I highly recommend that. It goes deep into that time of Henry VIII and Cromwell and Anne Boleyn and what have you, and it's actually from his perspective. And you can almost smell the fire, the way that Hilary Mantel writes, and you can almost, he talks a little bit about music in the context of all that. And for us, early music is a beautiful sound, but back then it was actually had its place in a ritual, in ceremony. You could smell the incense sometimes, or you can smell the candles. One of my favorite pieces, still one of my favorite pieces, even though it's pretty standard, but the Miserere by Allegri, I can still smell the incense if it's performed well, and part of a ritual that draws us in. And I think that sometimes we forget about that. And the Taoist scholars and these groups are fantastic, but it's a little bit, it's separated from that ceremony. So it's a long description, but I feel that Rosa Mystica actually, to me, is again pays homage to that idea of special rituals and ceremony in particularly Christmas time.
Well, that's perfect. I hope we can bring the audience into that space in those 6 minutes. Thank you so much, Andrew.
No problem. It's my pleasure.